Roman collapse in Britain caused society to localise. From being a provincial cog governed as a whole in an imperially scaled machine, authorities at their largest now commanded hundreds of people at most. At their smallest, individual families were independent of any authority but their own. The written record is unclear on how kingship arose. It would have us believe that ideas about government came ready-made from the Germanic world. Bands of conquerors had come and outmanoeuvred the Romano-British, forcing them westward. Those who most proved themselves in this bloodbath, we are led to believe, would gain the inherited title King. Anglo-Saxon kings centuries later could trace their ancestry back to these early war leaders. But these figures and their achievements are fictional. The records were written centuries after the fact. Germanic arrivals were not conquerors, they were settlers. But kingdoms still appeared, and still considered warfare to be an integral aspect of their identity. Kings had every benefit to believing that they could trace their ancestry back to the superlative war leader. So, if not through conquest, then how did kingdoms emerge in post-Roman Britain? What powers did kings wield? What roles did war and conquest really play? How and why did kings trace their ancestry back to conquering war leaders? The localised nature of post-Roman Britain meant that the population engaged almost exclusively in subsistence farming, with the arbitrary piece of land that they had claimed. This means that they farmed only enough to meet the needs of themselves and their family. It was unnecessary to grow and store any more than this. Trade which originated outside the local area was rare and expensive. Crops were sown, grown and reaped. Animals were birthed, tended to and slaughtered. A long, labour-intensive process. Growing and storing more food than would be eaten was a disproportionately large increase in effort for no gain. In theory, this put all farmers in the same place. But in practice, not so much. Some owned more fertile land, or their harvests were more efficient. There were less opportunities for thieves, neighbouring land was unoccupied, they had children or servants to farm their land. Whatever the reason, an endemic ability to provide a surplus by accident would give opportunities that most did not have. Over the process of years, a bad harvest was a statistical certainty. Rainfall, theft, sabotage, countless other factors. One bad harvest, when subsistence farming, leaves families and societies totally destitute. This could mean the difference between rationing and feasting with your produce, or between life and death. Those who were shielded from failure and could provide a surplus secured influence over their neighbours by helping or threatening them. They forced them into subservience by taking a proportion of their land's produce. The food that they demanded, and the food that the unlucky gave, is called a food rent, marking a change in relationship from neighbours to landlord and renter. Food rent is the economic foundation of Anglo-Saxon kingship. Using it, a landowner and whoever he chooses is supported by the renters, and can devote their lives to something which isn't the production of food. In the post-Roman period, above all, they would need to protect what they already had, and if possible, to expand it, both of which would require a focus on military prowess. It's worth emphasising that this is just one theoretical example of how a landowner may emerge. There are many ways that individuals can accumulate land. Some may have accumulated it in this fashion, but others may have bought it, in the Roman period or afterwards. Others may have conquered it from another successful landowner, or may have been felt to have a historic claim, or any mixture of these may be true. No two stories are identical or predictable, but the end results of them all is the extraction of food rent. Small independent families were replaced with larger authorities, who controlled the food supply within their local area, and who would need to enforce that right through a military presence. Burdeswald in modern northern England is one such example of this. In its prime, it was used for centuries to defend and enforce the northernmost boundary of the Roman Empire. After, it was either briefly abandoned then re-inhabited, or continuously inhabited by fewer and fewer people. The Roman masonry began to decay, and it was not restored with the same skill. Instead, new buildings were erected from recycled stone. The Praetorium was repurposed into what might have been a church, and later on, timber buildings were erected, houses or structures to replace the stone buildings which had totally collapsed. A post-Roman authority at Burduswald was able to extract food rent and other resources from the nearby hinterlands, which they then used to support themselves and their companions, at the centre of the local economy. As Burduswald was a defensive structure, the implication is that defence was integral after the fall of Rome. War, both offensive and defensive, was evidently important enough to this post-Roman authority that they defined their identity by it. Post-Roman British societies were clearly run on a very, very small scale, with central facets of food rent extraction and the expression of military might. There is similar evidence at Vindolanda, further east, at South Shields, further south, and at Binchester. All of them show evidence of some form of post-Roman activity, continued habitation long after direct Roman control of Britain had fallen away. It was obviously a purposeful decision to either move into or to never leave these forts. The Roman fort at Burduswald would have been known throughout the local area, so the inhabitants had an exclusive claim to be carrying the torch of Roman authority. By using the fort, they had an uninterrupted thread in local history, connecting themselves from the present to the Roman past. Their position was given authority and historical backing, even if this connection was tenuous at best or entirely fictional. Burduswald was abandoned in the later 5th century. Power may have declined over time, or may have moved somewhere more geographically convenient and central, or it may have been conquered, suppressed, or subsumed by a more capable military power, or indeed any mixture of the above factors may be true. There would have been many dozens of authorities like this throughout Britain, who had claimed the exclusive right to extract food rent, which then slowly declined, were enveloped, or otherwise dissipated. The Lindum Colonia was a Roman town in the east of Britain. Like Burduswald, other Roman forts, and any other town in Britain, it was purpose-built for defence and used as an economic centre for centuries. After Rome, its existence was given new meaning, as a post-Roman landowner centralised their landholding on it. They extracted food rent and fought offensive and defensive wars under the guise of continuing the legacy of Roman power in the area. The authority and people living near the town had identified themselves by Lindum. In Brittonic, they called themselves Lindes, the people of the Roman city of Lindum, which would later, in Old English, become Lindsey. Lindsey, by the 7th century, was the primary power of the area, extracting food rent in an area wider than Burduswald could fathom, exclusively controlling the territory between the Humber and the Wash. Through a mixture of peaceful and forceful land acquisition, Lindsey came to dominate its local landscape. But it is important to remember that it was not destiny that Lindsey would rise. Other landowners were there as well, who Lindsey had dealt with through war and assimilation to become the dominant power between the Humber and the Wash. Some of these competing powers were Germanic, and through assimilation, Lindsey came to speak Old English, and understood its heritage by the 6th century as purely Germanic. Lindsey is unique in that it explicitly shows us that there was an assimilation between British and Germanic people. Former kings with Germanic names, like Winter, are recorded alongside former kings with British names, like Cadbad. Kent seems to be an identical story. The old Roman fort of Cantium, which was inhabited by the Romano-British, came to dominate the area between the Thames and the English Channel, through a mixture of acquisition peacefully and by conquest. It wasn't only the Roman pass that was used by these early kingdoms though. Bernicia, or in Brittonic Brenaich, tentatively translates to Land of the Mountain Passes. Deira stems from the Celtic name for the river Derwent, a minor subsidiary of the Humber. We have very little evidence to suppose about the birth of these kingdoms. but the kingdom's Brittonic name origins suggest that a pre-Roman past was used in the same way that Kent and Lindsey used a Roman past, and that they likely based themselves in pre-Roman hill forts or other man-made landscape features to justify their position. These four kingdoms show us that, beyond all doubt, there was an assimilation of Germanic ideas. Power and inheritance of that power was slowly expressed in more Germanic ways. The Roman past fell out of favour, and though pre-Roman hill forts and henge monuments were still used, they took on new meaning. Howard Williams has written on the reuse of these historic places. Older monuments may have been used by elites to portray themselves as the legitimate heirs of the ancient peoples and supernatural beings that were perceived to have originally built these structures. Yet, at another level, monument reuse could have evoked memories of imagined homelands across the North Sea. Against a backdrop of the appropriation of Germanic culture, origin stories in these kingdoms would shift away from involving a Roman or pre-Roman inheritance. In Kent, the Germanic origin story makes no mention of Cantium at all, emphasising instead Hengist's conquest of Kent, an entirely imagined past, creating a sense of identity, community and shared history. In the process, this legitimised a king's powerful position in the present. The identity itself was entirely new and arbitrary. It was defined only by the landowner and the land that they owned or claimed. The past that they used was entirely fictitious, but it worked. It established a historic basis for new authorities and legitimised the rights of kings to exercise power. The people believed that they were once brave warriors who, through being led by a great war leader, had gained their land. The war leader became king, and, provided his descendants could also lead in war, they deserved to inherit his position. It is out of this background, one of seeking to explain positions of power, one of an integrality of war leadership, one of a visibly long and mysterious past in the British landscape, and one of a need to create identities that were subservient to the king, that stories of conquerors were created. Peter Birch writes that the basic and flexible nature of post-Roman kingship was ideally suited to the post-Roman 5th century context, shorn of political and governmental structures from which it emerged. In a world where bureaucracy has totally disappeared, it makes sense that a kingship based almost exclusively on personal relations and war leadership would replace it. The king was dependent upon his companions to follow his orders, and upon his farmers to provide their food rent, as much as they in turn were dependent on him to lead in wars successfully. Kingdoms in Britain were not born from Germanic warlords conquering the land, they were born instead from the collection of food rent. However they had gained this position, they felt a need to justify and explain it through the world that they saw. The island of Britain with growing connections to the Germanic world. They also saw a Britain in which war leadership was an important aspect. Adept military leaders would thrive, but inept military leaders and the people that they led would dissipate. Wars were not remembered accurately, if at all, but from the fights a culture was forged, and by the mid-6th century, dominance of Germanic culture in the east of Britain would utilise these ideas, connecting right by conquest to their perceived ancestral homelands across the North Sea. The past was used to explain how the world was, and to explain why the king was an essential component in all of it. By the 7th century, the dynasties who had tried to justify themselves were embedded into the history of the British Isles, and in the minds of their denizens, they were intrinsically associated with it. Thank you for watching. If you really enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you liked, commented, subscribed, and shared it with people who may be interested. The more people who see and like these videos, the more time I can justify spending to make them. On the left, you can watch a playlist of videos like this, and on the right is whatever YouTube thinks you should watch. Again, thank you a lot.